What happens when one of the most respected voices in the black church takes the mic and publicly calls out a fellow mega-church pastor by name? When Bishop Morton looked straight into the crowd and declared, "The gospel is not for sale," he wasn't speaking in riddles. He was sending a direct shot at Creflo Dollar. And the shockwaves from that moment are still rattling pulpits, pews, and entire congregations across the country. It started like any other Sunday service music, praise, and the kind of electric energy that fills a room before the sermon begins. But when Bishop Morton stepped up to the podium, there was a different weight in his presence. His tone was calm, but his eyes told the crowd this wasn't going to be business as usual. Then came the words that sliced through the air. Like a lightning bolt, "You don't sell the gospel. You don't manipulate God's people. This ain't about jets and mansions. This is about souls." The room fell silent. No murmurs, no shuffling, just the heavy stillness of thousands processing what they'd just heard. Morton didn't name names, at least not yet. But everyone in that room, and many watching online, knew exactly who he was talking about. The clip hit social media within hours, and the comments lit up. Some applauded Morton for speaking truth with no filter. Others accused him of breaking an unspoken code among pastors: never publicly rebuke a fellow preacher. But Morton wasn't just venting frustration. According to insiders close to his circle, this rebuke had been building for months, maybe even years. He'd grown increasingly concerned about what he saw as the commercialization of faith, and in his eyes, Creflo Dollar's recent tithing reversal was the final straw. What began as a sermon quickly became a statement, a line in the sand that the prosperity gospel could no longer cross without pushback. And as we'll see next, this wasn't just about a difference in doctrine. It was about decades of history, influence, and the money that tied them together. To understand why Bishop Morton's words landed with such force, you have to rewind a few months to a moment that stunned the Christian world. Creflo Dollar, one of the most recognizable faces of prosperity, preaching stood before his congregation and said something almost no one saw coming. "Throw away every book, every tape, every sermon I ever preached on tithing, because it's not biblical." This was the same man who had spent decades insisting that giving 10% of your income was a divine command, a covenant that unlocked supernatural blessings. He'd built an empire on that: message books, conferences, TV programs, and a global church network that reached millions. His sermons had moved believers to dig deep into their pockets, often with the promise that God would return their gift tenfold. So when he told his followers to toss everything he'd ever taught on the subject, reactions split like an earthquake. Some saw it as a humble admission, proof that even powerful leaders could grow and change. Others saw it as betrayal, a too little, too late confession after decades of collecting tithes under what he now admitted was a flawed doctrine. And here's the part that really fueled the controversy. Critics argued that while his teaching had changed, his lifestyle had not. The private jet, the multi-million-dollar mansion, the luxury cars, none of it seemed to be going anywhere. For Bishop Morton, this wasn't a simple theological shift. It looked like a calculated pivot in branding, one that left countless believers questioning whether their sacrifices had been in vain. But this reversal wasn't happening in a vacuum. It was about to ripple through churches across America, shaking both pastors and congregations to their core. Creflo Dollar's announcement didn't just spark debate, it ignited a crisis of trust. In churches across the country, pastors suddenly found themselves facing questions they weren't prepared to answer. Members who had faithfully tithed for years were now asking, "Pastor, do you still believe in tithing? Didn't you teach what Creflo taught? If he was wrong, were we wrong too?" For some leaders, it was a nightmare scenario. Entire ministries had been built on the same prosperity blueprint. Creflo championed promises of financial breakthrough, tied directly to giving. Now, One of the movement's loudest voices had flipped the script, and those who followed his model were left scrambling. Behind closed doors, the tension was even sharper. In leaked recordings from private pastors, round tables, leaders could be heard debating their next moves. Some worried that changing course would destroy their credibility. Others feared that holding the line would cost them the next generation of believers. The air was thick with unease, because this wasn't just a doctrinal tweak. It was a challenge to the very system that had kept many churches financially afloat. Meanwhile, in the pews, the whispers turned into open conversations. Offerings reportedly dropped in some congregations as members chose to wait and see rather than give. Out of habit, social media became a battleground, with church members sharing personal stories of financial strain, sacrifices made, and promises that never seemed to materialize. For Bishop Paul Morton, this was exactly the moment to speak up. In his eyes, the issue wasn't just about money. It was about integrity, accountability, and protecting the flock from teachings that could be manipulated for personal gain. And as we'll see next, his call-out wasn't just a reaction. It was the culmination of years of watching prosperity culture grow unchecked. Bishop Paul Morton has never been afraid to speak truth to power, but this time felt different. Friends say he'd been quietly warning about the dangers of prosperity, preaching for years, urging leaders to stay grounded in Scripture and avoid turning the pulpit into a marketplace. He'd confronted pastors privately, hoping to spark change, without creating public division. But with Creflo Dollar's reversal, and the way it sent shockwaves through congregations, Morton decided the time for private talks was over. His message, though measured, carried a sharp edge. The gospel is not for sale, and it never was. To Morton, this wasn't about embarrassing Creflo Dollar or starting a feud. It was about drawing a clear line. In his view, when ministers preach one thing for decades, profit from it, and then simply walk it back, they owe more than a quiet correction. They owe answers. Morton's frustration also came from watching the prosperity gospel flourish in communities that could least afford it. For many believers in Black and urban churches, the promise of supernatural wealth was more than a sermon. It was hope in the face of poverty, unemployment, and inequality. But that hope often came with a price, giving beyond their means, sometimes at the expense of rent, bills, or basic needs. Not by speaking out. Morton wasn't just questioning Creflo Dollar's teaching. He was challenging a culture that rewards spiritual celebrity over servant leadership. He wanted pastors to remember that their first responsibility was to God and their congregations, not to personal brand building or luxury lifestyles, but calling out one of the most influential preachers in the country was bound to stir up controversy. Some applauded Morton for his courage, while others accused him of airing church business in public. And as the debate deepened, another layer of the story began to emerge, one that suggested Creflo's reversal might not have been purely spiritual at all. When Creflo Dollar told the world to toss out decades of his own teachings on tithing, many took it at face value, a spiritual awakening, pastor humbling himself before God. But behind the scenes, a different narrative was taking shape. Whispers began circulating among ministry insiders and former staff members. Was this really about theology, or was it about survival? Dollar's ministry, like many megachurch empires, had long operated in a gray zone when it came to finances. As a tax-exempt religious organization, his church wasn't required to publicly disclose detailed spending. Still, the lavish lifestyle, a $3 million mansion, luxury cars, and a $65 million private jet had drawn scrutiny for years. That attention wasn't just from the media. According to multiple sources, the IRS had been quietly monitoring high-profile prosperity preachers, and Creflo was no stranger to their radar. Some insiders claimed that months before his tithing announcement, subtle changes were happening behind the curtain. Senior staff departures, restructured boards, shifts in accounting practices, and tighter distinctions between ministry travel and personal trips. One former accountant, speaking anonymously, alleged that the church had been advised to clean up the books in anticipation of possible audits. The timing of Creflo's reversal raised eyebrows. Could distancing himself from a hardline tithing stance also help reshape how incoming donations were classified? Could it soften the optics of wealth and excess in the eyes of investigators or the public? No one in his camp confirmed those theories, but the speculation persisted. For Bishop Morton, however, the motive didn't change the damage. Whether spiritual or strategic, the abrupt reversal left millions of believers questioning the sincerity of everything they'd been taught. And the longer Creflo remained vague about the deeper reasons for his shift, the more the vacuum filled with suspicion, frustration, and demands for answers. But the ripple effects weren't confined to one man's ministry. They were starting to unsettle the foundation of prosperity, preaching itself. And what happened next would test the unity of church leadership like never before. Creflo Dollar's change of course didn't just dent his own credibility, it sent shockwaves through the entire prosperity gospel network. For decades, this movement had been a united front, with its biggest names defending each other from critics, regulators, and the press. But now, behind closed doors, that unity was fracturing. Pastors who had built their ministries on the same promises were suddenly facing hard choices. Some quietly began tweaking their language, shifting from tithing to generosity or grace-based giving, hoping to avoid the backlash while keeping donations flowing. Others doubled down, publicly defending tithing and painting Creflo's reversal as dangerous and confusing to believers. In private clergy meetings, the conversations turned tense. One bishop, according to leaked audio, warned, "If we admit we were wrong, we lose trust. If we say nothing, we lose the next generation." It was a lose-lose situation, and the tension was palpable. The impact on congregations was immediate. Some church members, already weary from economic hardship, began questioning why their pastors lived in comfort while they struggled to pay bills. In certain churches, offerings dropped sharply, forcing leaders to cut programs or staff. In others, members left altogether, disillusioned and distrustful. Meanwhile, critics outside the movement saw an opening. The reversal gave them fresh ammunition, with religious watchdog groups and media outlets highlighting what they called the inherent flaws of prosperity theology. For them, Creflo's pivot was proof that the foundation of the movement was unstable and perhaps even unsustainable in the long run. And in the middle of this storm, Bishop Paul S. Morton's voice grew louder. His call for accountability wasn't just about Creflo, it was about dismantling a culture of unchecked authority where pastors operated like CEOs without boards or oversight. That challenge was rattling the very power structures that had protected prosperity preachers for decades. But as Morton's message spread, another question began to take shape. If the prosperity gospel could unravel this quickly, what would happen if more leaders stepped forward to admit the same thing? Once Bishop Paul S. Morton went public, the reaction from the church world split down the middle. On one side were pastors, theologians, and everyday believers who praised him for finally saying out loud what many had whispered in private, that the gospel should never be a business model. They flooded his social media with comments like, "Thank you for protecting the flock, and this is the leadership we need." On the other side were Creflo Dollar loyalists and defenders of the prosperity gospel who saw Morton's move as divisive and unnecessary, accusing him of publicly tearing down a fellow minister instead of handling it the biblical way behind closed doors. But what truly stood out wasn't just the backlash, it was the silence. High-profile names in ministry, many of whom had shared stages with both Morton and Dollar, simply said nothing. No statements, no interviews, no social media posts. Leaders who were usually quick to speak on hot-button issues suddenly went quiet. And that silence spoke volumes. Behind the scenes, that quiet was strategic. Several insiders say some pastors feared that taking a public stance could alienate their own congregations, especially if they had followed similar teachings on tithing. Others were concerned that aligning with either man could trigger unwanted scrutiny into their own finances and church practices. As one anonymous pastor put it bluntly, when you throw stones, people start checking your windows. Meanwhile, Morton's words continued to ripple far beyond his own congregation. They made their way into Bible study debates, prayer circles, and even secular talk shows covering faith and money. For many believers, the conversation shifted from, is Creflo right or wrong, to, who do we really trust with our faith and finances? And perhaps most telling of all, members from across the country began reporting changes in their own churches. More transparency in how donations were spent, more teaching about generosity without financial promises, and in some cases, the quiet dropping of tithing requirements altogether. Morton's challenge had touched a nerve, and the ripple effects were only growing. But then came whispers of something even bigger, something that could suggest Creflo Dollar's reversal was less about spiritual awakening and more about protecting himself from a looming storm. For the public, Creflo Dollar's tithing reversal looked like a bold spiritual shift. But in private, according to several former staffers and ministry insiders, it was less of a revelation and more of a strategic retreat. Whispers swirled about looming audits, quiet legal consultations, and financial restructuring that had started. Months before his announcement ever hit the pulpit, some of those whispers trace back to an uncomfortable history. In 2007, Dollar was one of 6 televangelists named in a U.S. Senate investigation led by Senator Chuck Grassley, probing whether church funds were being misused for personal luxury. At the time, Dollar refused to fully cooperate, citing religious freedom, and the probe ended without formal penalties. But the shadow it cast never completely disappeared. Fast forward to recent years, and sources claim that the IRS has renewed interest in high-profile ministries operating with opaque finances. In Creflo's case, insiders allege his team began separating personal and ministry travel expenses, reshuffling board members, and liquidating certain assets that could raise questions during an audit. One former accountant, who requested anonymity, said, "The shift in teaching lined up perfectly with the changes in accounting. That's not coincidence." Why would changing doctrine matter in this context? Because if a church moves away from a mandatory tithing model, it can alter how donations are legally classified and reported. For some watchdogs, that timing was suspiciously convenient. And for Bishop Morton, it didn't matter whether the reversal was about IRS pressure, public perception, or personal conviction. What mattered was that the people who had given faithfully for decades were left with no real explanation and no accountability. Even among Creflo's supporters, there was unease. A few prominent pastors quietly admitted they were keeping a close eye on how his finances would be handled going forward. Meanwhile, critics saw his pivot as an attempt to rebrand from prosperity preacher to wise elder ahead of a possible ministry relaunch that could appeal to a broader Christian audience. But the danger of a move like this is simple. When a leader shifts so dramatically without clear transparency, it doesn't just shake trust in that leader, it shakes trust in the entire system. And that's exactly what was beginning to happen. Congregations weren't just questioning Creflo Dollar. They were questioning the very foundation of prosperity theology itself. And as trust eroded, one final revelation threatened to turn this controversy into a full-blown reckoning for the modern church. The longer this controversy played out, the more it became clear this wasn't just about Creflo Dollar, and it wasn't just about Bishop Paul S. Morton. This was about the soul of modern ministry. For years, the prosperity gospel had promised believers that faith and finances went hand in hand, that giving was the key to unlocking God's blessings. Now, one of its loudest voices had pulled the rug out from under that promise, and the cracks in the system were no longer hidden. Pastors across the country were facing a choice: double down and defend the old model, or embrace a new era of transparency and accountability. Some began holding open forums where members could ask exactly how donations were being spent. Others released financial reports for the first time. And in a few congregations, leaders publicly apologized for pushing teachings that had left members feeling manipulated or misled. But for many believers, those steps came too late. The trust had already been damaged. Former churchgoers were speaking out online, telling stories of sacrificing rent money, skipping meals, or maxing out credit cards in hopes of a breakthrough that never came. Their testimonies weren't just heartbreaking, they were evidence of a deeper wound, one that would take years to heal. Meanwhile, Creflo Dollar continued preaching, reframing his ministry under the banner of grace and generosity. Yet the questions lingered. Was this genuine repentance or a calculated reinvention? Why had there been no clear acknowledgement of the harm done? And if this reversal truly came from a place of conviction, why not lead the charge for broader reform in the church? Bishop Morton, for his part, showed no signs of backing down. His message was spreading beyond his own fellowship, inspiring conversations in Bible colleges, seminary classes, and even secular media about whether the prosperity gospel's days were numbered. The stage is now set for a defining moment in the Black church, and perhaps the global church at large. Will leaders choose to confront the flaws of a system that blends Scripture with salesmanship? Or will they protect the brand, even if it means losing the trust of the very people they're called to serve? One thing is certain: the eyes of both believers and skeptics are watching. And whatever happens next will not just shape the legacy of Creflo Dollar and Paul S. Morton, it will shape the future of faith itself.